Wasabi guys, welcome back to another how to build around this commander video. We've already previewed some of the newer commander options coming out in the upcoming Streets of New Capenna set, but one that really caught my eye, and I know a lot of you agree, it's looking like already one of the more interesting commander options. Lord Xander the Collector kind of gives you an old school feel back in the day where your commander options were more expensive because if you didn't already know, EDH stands for Elder Dragon Highlander, you know that thing. You could play Nicol Bolas back in the day and it wasn't that big of a joke. Now it's not super realistic because we have better commander options that only cost you like 3 or 4 mana. You can get them out there sooner. You can realistically replay them several times as well. For more expensive commander options, you're going to have to pay a commander tax each time. But even more than that, this is just an old school commander if you compare abilities. But before I get into it, first I would like to remind you, if you have not already, please do subscribe to the channel. It does mean a lot. So Lord Xander the Collector is a 7 mana, blue, black, and red Vampire Demon Noble, a 6/6 with 3 triggers. First, when it enters, target opponent discards half the cards in their hand, rounded down. That to me isn't that big of a deal because it is rounded down, so if they have a max of 7 cards in their hand, they're only going to have to discard 3. And since when you play Lord Xander, your opponents are probably not going to have a full hand size, you should realistically expect maybe 2 cards or 1 card. I still think it's good if you want to synergize with that ability, it's just maybe not the strongest part of this commander. The attack trigger, however, is pretty ridiculous. Whenever he attacks, defending player mills half their library rounded down. That is way more substantial, even if it is rounded down, because you're at least going to be getting 30 to 40 cards off of this, no problem. The third ability is an aristocrat ability. When Lord Xander dies, target opponent sacrifices half the non-land permanents they control, rounded down. I like that. I still think that's pretty good. However, that middle ability is still what's going to carry this commander, and if you want to build around it, there are a few different ways that I would suggest you do so, making full use of all of these triggers. You don't just want to ignore one of them. But going back to what I said before with Nicol Bolas, this has an old school feel because it's a lot like Zadek, Lord of Secrets. Big 7 mana creature back in the day. You saw this guy a lot more often. Great attack trigger for what mill was again back in the day, and of course even more recently, if you go back to Commander 2013, you remember Thraximundar. Thraximundar saw a lot of play back then, but kind of fell off a bit because it's a bit more expensive than people are willing to pay, especially in colors like these where you don't have the best ramp. I feel like green gets away with a lot because green can provide you with a lot of mana dorks. So turn 1 you can ramp up pretty easily, here you cannot, and that's going to be something we address at the very end of the video. But first, let's talk about how to synergize with the very first trigger, anything forcing your opponents to discard. You should probably consider some of these cards here. Liliana's Caress and Megrim I think are great. They're cheap options that sit on the field, and if you not only do this with your commander's trigger, but you have other creatures that force to discard like Felspectre, it's going to be a lot more beneficial, seeing as they're going to be losing 2 life or they're going to be dealt 2 damage each time they discard a card. There are other benefits to this. Of course, you have Geth's Grimoire and you have Sanchromancer, there's card draw, there's life gain. I talked about this when Lord Xander was spoiled, but you're going to be playing kind of a group slug strategy, and group slug is similar to group hug, but instead of helping everyone, your deck's focus is hurting everyone. And these will kind of help to alleviate the gang up that you're probably going to experience just by forcing everyone to discard cards, sacrifice creatures. They don't like doing that, so they're probably going to single you out. It's always nice to gain some of that life back with a Sanchromancer or to draw some cards off of forcing their discard. Intergrid is really what you go for when you want to lean into the group slug strategy. No illusions there, you're not trying to be anyone's friend, so go for the most powerful options. Moving on to mill, I think it is way more powerful and therefore a bit more viable as a strategy. Milling half a player's library is insane, and combined with Bruvak the Grandiloquent, that could be game over. This is where the whole rounded down thing can kind of be annoying, but that's still incredible for a 3 mana creature that sits on the field waiting for you to attack your opponents. Mindcrank, of course, is a supplemental card to help you mill more. Court of Cunning, in addition to making you the Monarch, which again, lean into it, you're probably going to be hated, will also mill your opponents a whole bunch of cards. At the beginning of your upkeep, if you are the Monarch, they each have to mill 10 cards. And to add insult to injury, we have cards like Maddening Cacophony, in addition to old school ones like Traumatize, where you could force your opponents to mill half their library. That is rounded up, by the way, so it is a little bit better than our commander's trigger, but 6 mana to do that to each opponent. And oh yeah, by the way, there are also really good cards that can benefit us in the strategy, like Sir Conrad the Grim and Dreadhound. Dreadhound especially, I think, is worth talking about because I think everyone knows by now what Sir Conrad does, but with Dreadhound in combination with with something like a maddening cacophony could easily win you the game, because whenever a creature dies or a creature card is put into a graveyard from a library, each opponent loses 1 life, so it doesn't matter whose creature it is. Out of your 3 opponents, if you have 3 opponents and they're milling half their library, let's say they have maybe, at least 7 creatures each, well, they're each going to be losing 21 life. And I believe 7 is a pretty conservative estimate. Probably going to be a lot more if it's half their library. Just saying, these 2 cards can be really deadly if you go for mill. Now, to synergize with the last ability, I don't think we need to really talk about forcing your opponents to sacrifice a bunch of non-land permanents. We could address that with a bunch of cards you've probably already seen me talk about with aristocrat strategies, like Blood Artist, Grave Pact, things like that. But I think what's more important is to benefit off of replaying our commander each time he dies. Again, this is a 7-mana commander. You don't want to have to pay that commander tax too often. You do want to be able to replay your commander at least twice each game. So to do that realistically, we shouldn't have to get to 11 mana. It's great if we can, but we want to be able to replay our commander or have our commander come back from the graveyard or to our hand so we don't have to pay that tax. Phyrexian Reclamation has been an underrated card for a long time. For just 2 mana and 2 life, you get to return Xander to your hand if you decide to have him go to the graveyard when he dies. Kaya's Ghost form is still underrated. It's basically totem armor in black. Offers you a line of protection there if your creature dies. It comes back to the battlefield under your control. And this is what you want to put on Lord Xander because you'll get the death trigger and you'll return to the battlefield. And Malakir Rebirth is a very similar thing, ensuring that you will still have Xander out there when it's your next turn. There are other really fun ways of taking advantage of this, and honestly, I think you want most of your deck to be Group Slug, you want it to be Mill. I think a decent portion of your deck should be Reanimation, just so you get the Enter the Battlefield trigger, you get the death trigger, and you don't have to pay that commander tax too often. I think Virtus's Maneuver is a great card because it already synergizes with your Group Slug strategy while allowing you to bring back Xander to your hand. Cauldron Dance is a cool card. It is 6 mana at instant speed, but you can only use it during combat. You'll be able to return Xander from the graveyard to the battlefield, and at the beginning of the next end step, you return him to your hand. You also get to put a creature card from your hand onto the battlefield, give that creature haste, and you sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. So, a lot going on there, a lot of potential there for an explosive play. And Necromantic Selection is basically a board wipe where you get to benefit off of destroying all creatures, but you'll also be able to bring back a creature from the graveyard to the battlefield. I suggest doing that with Lord Xander. A final strategy that I recommend actually because it has some potential. It is more of a flavor win than anything else. We're talking about Vampire Tribal. He's also a demon, he's also a noble, but I don't think there's really enough support for demons yet. And I think really once you look at some of the vampires we can fool around with, you'll agree that it's definitely a viable direction to build this deck. Now, why I say Vampire Tribal is for years we've been teased by Wizards of the Coast. We've been given Jaleva, we've been given Garzazal back in the day, and we even have Blood Tyrant, really cool vampire from Conflux. But we never really felt like we could make a Grixis-colored Vampire Tribal deck. But now I think because of the Graveyard synergy, because vampires have such a wide variety of abilities, and with one of the most recent sets in Crimson Vow giving us more vampire support, I think it could actually work. We have Bloodline Necromancer bringing back a vampire from our graveyard to the battlefield. Olivia Crimson Bride, when she attacks, we get to bring back Lord Xander from our graveyard to the battlefield. And Haunting Voyage, any kind of Patriarch's Bidding card where you get to bring back all of your vampires. It's going to be even better when you have an incentive to bring back our 7-mana commander. And finally, if you decide to build around Lord Xander, you cannot forget this ultimate rule, the rule of ramp. You know, Soul Ring is great. You probably want to play Soul Ring in any deck though. Falwar Stone, Arcane Signet are great if you're playing at least a couple colors. Makes it almost guaranteed that you're able to tap for the exact colors that you need. The Talismans, let's say you don't need the mana at that moment, you can always just tap for colorless. And the Signets from the original Ravnica block are always nice because they filter for 2 different colors. So that right there, you have 2 mana rocks, that's kind of the standard. It's great, right? But it could be so much better. So why don't you play a Burnished Heart? Get yourself some more lands. Dark Ritual even. I know it's not ideal if you're not playing a more competitive deck that needs to win instantly, but 3 mana for 1 mana, if you can get Xander out there earlier, you're going to force an opponent to discard more cards. And if you have the budget, let's say you want to play a more expensive version of this deck, then I can't imagine why you wouldn't want to play things like Mana Crypt or Mana Vault. The unfortunate thing is that if you're not prepared to play a lot of Reanimation, you're probably going to want to play a ton of ramp. 7 mana commanders in non-green decks are sometimes difficult to play. This will make that experience a little bit easier. So anyway, let me know what you think about Lord Xander the Collector. Let me know what you think about the upcoming set, The Streets of New Capenna. As always, if you have not already, please do subscribe to the channel. Commander Void here signing off. I will see you all next time.